I think of the best video game sequels ever made, I think of games like Halo 2, Metal Gear Solid 2, Super Mario Galaxy 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and, of course, Resident Evil 2. There's few games out there that come as close to perfection as a game like Resident Evil 2 does. Many people like to use the phrase lightning in a bottle to describe such games, but I don't think that quite describes what Resident Evil 2 actually accomplishes. So what does this game actually accomplish then? Well, it does the same thing that all of the other aforementioned games do. What a sequel should do. Taking everything that was great about the predecessor and making it better. Since the release of Resident Evil 2, there have been sequels upon sequels in the Resident Evil franchise, but none of them have had the same impact as Resident Evil 2 did. Okay, well, maybe RE4 did, but my point is that there's something special about Resident Evil 2 that left such a lasting impression on me after I played it. And I still find myself coming back to this game again and again, even after all of these years. I wouldn't say it's the best Resident Evil game, but it is my personal favorite. So what is it exactly that makes this game so damn good? Why is it so fun to play through this game again and again and again? Because I have played through this game so many goddamn times. What about some of the more criticized aspects of the game, like the tank controls and the early 3D graphics? In this video, we'll be going over the gameplay, enemy design, level design, and the story, with the goal of explaining why I believe Resident Evil 2 is not only one of the best survival horror games ever made, but also one of the best video games ever made in general. So let's get started. Before I start explaining why I think the gameplay is so great, we need to address the elephant in the room. Tank controls and fixed camera angles. Oh boy. I see early Resident Evil games get put on blast for these things all the time. Tons of people are quick to write these games off because they're quote-unquote outdated and therefore bad. Now, I'm not about to start convincing you that tank controls are intuitive or that fixed camera angles and door opening animations are awesome or anything like that. In fact, I also would say this is outdated gameplay design, but I don't think that means these games are bad. We need to remember that at the time of release, there wasn't really a standard for 3D controls yet. Super Mario 64, considered to be the pioneer of 3D controls by many people, came out the same year as Resident Evil 1, and even Mario 64 could be considered outdated by today's standards. But that doesn't mean Mario 64 is a bad game, and it also doesn't mean Resident Evil is a bad game just because the controls are a little rough around the edges. I'd even go as far to say that it's quite the contrary. Old school Resident Evil games are built with these controls in mind. And after you get a good handle on the movement, you may start to find that these controls are actually complementary to the survival horror gameplay of Resident Evil. Not being able to see the entirety of a room as soon as you enter means that you need to rely on things like audio cues to maintain situational awareness. For example, although I might not be able to see the licker in the room, I know that he's there because I can hear him. My point is that yes, the controls can be a bit of a pain in the ass, but they're not as bad as I think people often make them out to be. Moving on. I've already said that Resident Evil 2 does everything Resident Evil 1 does, but better, which is a good way of summing things up in one concise sentence, but it doesn't truly explain how impressive this actually is. Because when I say they made everything better, I mean everything. RE1 had 2 characters to choose from, and depending on who you chose, you would get slightly different scenarios. Resident Evil 2 takes that idea and gives us 4 separate scenarios, literally double the amount of the first game. And not only that, but the decisions you make in the A scenario have an influence on what happens in the B scenario. For example, at one point you come across a side pack and a submachine gun, 2 very useful gameplay assets. You could take one, both, or none. The only catch is whatever you take or don't take will be what remains during the B scenario. This is what's called the zapping system, and it highlights the most important aspect of Resident Evil 2, which coincides with the most important aspect of survival horror games in general, and that is choice. Every bullet counts. Every healing item should be cherished. Every choice matters. Again, this is the exact same gameplay designed from RE1. RE2 just takes it to the next level. By giving the player this seemingly endless amount of choices, it means that across multiple playthroughs, you can really customize your preferred Resident Evil 2 experience. Do you go Leon A to Claire B or Claire A to Leon B? Do you take the side pack for scenario A, or would it be more useful in scenario B? Maybe you leave both the submachine gun and the side pack for scenario B, as it is much harder than scenario A. Or maybe you don't leave anything for scenario B because you don't plan on playing it at all. This is what makes the game so fun to play over and over again, because a lot of these decisions you make depend on how they will affect that specific playthrough, how they will help you in the moment. In a nutshell, Resident Evil 2 is a game of choices, where every choice matters, meaning that no one playthrough will be the same as the last. This is the gameplay that Resident Evil 1 established, but Resident Evil 2 is the one that perfected this gameplay. Alright, so that's the general gameplay experience that Resident Evil 2 provides. Now let's get into the details, like level design, enemy design, and all that good stuff. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about something else. Something that I think a lot of people may not appreciate as much as they should. That is the weapon sandbox. The reason I think people tend to not realize how great the weapon sandbox truly is because the act of using your weapons is about as basic as you can imagine. One button for aiming and one button for shooting. Although the weapons seem simple on the surface, in actuality, each one serves a specific role and can be used in unique ways to maximize its effectiveness. The shotgun, for example, can blast the heads off multiple zombies with a single shot, while also being generally reliable in most situations. The grenade launcher is like the shotgun in being a well-rounded weapon overall, but it can be loaded with 3 different ammo types that each have their own unique properties. The bowgun fires 3 arrows that go in slightly different directions, but when used up close, can have all 3 hit a zombie's head, taking him out in one shot, so the bowgun is all about accuracy. Then you got something like the spark shot, which is completely unique and fires bursts of electricity. Even the most basic weapon of all, the handgun, has some interesting gimmicks to go along with it. In Leon's game, it can be customized into a 3-round burst, and in Claire's game, you can switch it out for a revolver. The only weapon that sticks out as not really adding anything to the game is the flamethrower, which is meant to be used against the Ivy monsters in the laboratory at the end. However, there are other weapons that are much more effective at doing this. It's also given to you way too late in the game to be used anywhere else, but hey, it's still there if you're bored and want to mess around with it. So having a varied weapon sandbox adds a lot to the game, but what makes it even more interesting is that every weapon has its advantages and disadvantages. The Magnum is a powerhouse, but its ammo is incredibly scarce. The grenade launcher is similarly powerful, but the several ammo types means it tends to take up inventory space. The submachine gun has rapid fire capabilities, but once it runs out of ammo, it cannot be reloaded. Claire's revolver has a much faster rate of fire than her base pistol, but it can only hold 6 rounds. And on top of all of this, you cannot take every single weapon with you for every single encounter. You have to do some micromanagement to decide what weapon will be most effective for the specific situation, which falls right back into the idea of making meaningful choices. So while it ultimately does just come down to aiming and shooting, deciding what you want to aim and shoot with is what makes the weapon sandbox kick so much ass. Now we're going to talk about the enemy design, and this is where things get really interesting, because let me tell you, I love the enemy design of Resident Evil 2. So let's go through each enemy one by one, starting with, of course, the zombies. Now the zombies are exactly what you would expect. They're slow, easy to outmaneuver, but dangerous when they're in large groups. I will say the AI for the zombies seems much more aggressive than it was in RE1. RE2 also places zombies in specific ways to prevent you from running past them, but we'll talk about that more when we get to level design. The Hellhounds are also back, and they're just as annoying as they always were, so not much to say there. Another enemy returning from RE1 is the spiders, which are the only enemies capable of poisoning you. I gotta say, if there is one monster design that I'd like to see done in a newer Resident Evil game, it would be these big fuzzy spiders. There has been spider-like monsters in modern games, but these are not spider-like monsters, okay? These are straight up big-ass fucking tarantulas that will bare their fangs and charge you down. It is fucking horrifying. Next up, we got the Lickers, which are sort of meant to replace the Hunters. Now, I love the Hunters, but I think the Lickers are much more interesting from a gameplay perspective. Also, the Hunters were, had that Olympic athlete jumping ability, which could get kind of annoying. You see, in RE1, the Hunters had to be saved as late game enemies because having them right from the beginning would be way too overwhelming. But with the Lickers, the game can introduce these guys right from the start because they're quite easily avoidable. It's not until later on, and you're much more equipped with stronger weapons, that the game starts making encounters with Lickers more like obstacles obstructing your path than just guys that would chase you to the end of the hallway. Having Lickers introduced from the beginning also helps to mix up some of the earlier encounters. Last and unfortunately least, we have the Ivy. Now, I don't think the Ivy itself is a poorly designed enemy. In fact, I think they work quite well as late game, more dangerous enemies. But they just aren't really used that much. I will say, though, I much prefer the original design of the Ivy as opposed to the remake's design. The original design is much more monstrous. Now let's talk about the bosses. And this is the only aspect of Resident Evil 2 where I think an argument could be made in favor of Resident Evil 1's boss lineup instead. I'm not saying RE1's bosses are better. I'm not even saying that's my own opinion. I'm just saying you could make that argument. Putting that aside though, RE2 has some pretty kick-ass bosses, with the standout being the lift platform battle with William Birkin. I really like that one. Although I do have to say, I'm not a big fan of the Super Tyrant fight at the end of the B scenario. There's just no space to move around, and Tyrant's attacks are virtually impossible to dodge, which is not very fun. And this is also a problem that Resident Evil games still struggle with to this day, which it kind of blows my mind. Like, they didn't figure this out yet, that small area to move in and a boss that's attack covers the entire area is not very fun to fight against. One thing I'd also like to point out is that in the original game, I felt that Birkin had a lot more of a presence throughout the game as opposed to the remake. In the remake, Birkin would just kind of show up when it was time for a boss fight, whereas in the original, I always got the vibe that Birkin was, always skulking around in the background, and he could be around any corner, which helps with adding tension. One of the best things about Resident Evil 2 is the level design. The Raccoon City police station is such an iconic setting within the Resident Evil franchise, and it's not just because of the aesthetic design. Actually, the aesthetic design of the police station doesn't really make a lot of sense when you think about it. I mean, what kind of a police station is built like this? This is just one of those things that you kind of have to look past, as realism was not a major focus of games during this time. I believe the real reason why the police station has become so iconic is more so due to the way it's designed and how the player is meant to traverse the station. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, let's break down how Resident Evil level design works. We have rooms and we have hallways. Rooms are typically more open areas. Sometimes they'll have a few enemies, sometimes they don't. Some rooms will have specific ways in which enemies will enter, like a Licker bursting through the glass, or zombies that seem to be dead until you do something to trigger them. Rooms are where the puzzles will often take place, and you'll usually need to return to a room multiple times to solve a certain puzzle. Then there's hallways. This is where most of the action takes place, as hallways are very narrow and don't give you a ton of room to dodge the zombies. It's not impossible to dodge the zombies, but it is very difficult. Not being able to dodge means you'll be forced to spend some ammo or take a few hits to get through. This is something that I think RE2 does much better than RE1, which is due to something I mentioned earlier about the AI of the zombies being better. In RE1, zombies were very predictable. They would shuffle toward you for a couple seconds, then they'd veer off to the left or right, giving you a chance to slip by. Whether it was in an open room or a narrow hallway, it didn't matter. Once you figured out the trick, you could basically run past every zombie in the game with little trouble. Which is why I think RE2 is so much more compelling in this regard, because you can't just juke your way through every zombie. The game forces you to make a decision. Spend ammo or spend herbs. RE2 is also much more willing to throw groups of zombies at you that require a considerable amount of firepower to take down. So that's the general breakdown of the level design. But what's particularly interesting is how the police station opens up as you make your way through. You begin with only 2 paths to choose between. But as you unlock doors and gather key items, more and more doors and pathways begin to open up. And even though the police station becomes pretty intricate during the middle section of the game, I never find myself getting lost or unsure about what to do next, which is a problem I found myself running into with RE3 and to a lesser extent Code Veronica as well. So yeah, the police station is great and all, but what about everything else, like the sewers and the laboratory? Well, first let's talk about the beginning of the game, which has you running around the streets of Raccoon City. It's a brief section, but I love the idea of running around the city streets that are crawling with zombies and monsters. And it's effective for letting the player learn the controls, even if they have to get eaten by zombies a couple times to learn the controls. Now, when we look at every individual location throughout Resident Evil 2, it doesn't seem like these locations would fit together, but somehow they do. The transition from the police station to the sewers and finally to the laboratory feels so natural and flows really, really well. The sewers are a lot more linear than the police station, but it works well and it makes sense for the game to give you more challenging hallway type areas to deal with rather than open areas where you can just dodge around all of the zombies. Now when it comes to the laboratory, it's not anything special really. It's, kind of just two paths you can go down. Go down this one, go back, go down that one, go back. Not too complex level design there. But it's still a good final area to close off the game. Again, I think if there was a bit more done with the Ivy, it would have been a lot better. Before we wrap up this section on level design, I'd like to point out one more thing that I love about the overall design, and that's the way key items are handled. Some key items that you find in Resident Evil 2 are not just one-off items, use it, discard it. Resident Evil 2 is really good for giving you items that have multiple uses and need to be used in multiple different areas and parts of the game. For example, the valve handle is given to you pretty early on, and while you do use it only once during the police station, the majority of its use is during the sewers. I find this more compelling than, finding a key item, using it, and then immediately discarding it, because when key items have multiple uses, it can add more strategy to how you manage your inventory. Now, on the topic of the story, I'm going to try to keep things brief about the story of Resident Evil 2 because, let's be honest, it's hard to take this story seriously with the early 3D graphics and the corny voice acting. But I do think Resident Evil 2 deserves credit for continuing the story of Resident Evil 1. Since the franchise was still in its infancy, it would have been really easy for them to just wipe the slate clean and have a whole new story with a whole new cast of characters, but they didn't do that. In fact, there's tons of connections to RE1, like the fact that Ada is searching for her boyfriend John, and of course in RE1, John and Ada were the username and password needed for the computer. Little stuff like that is really good for fleshing out the world, and I'm kind of upset that detail was not brought up in the remake. Anyways, when it comes to the story itself, there's not really much to say other than Resident Evil 2 has some of the funniest goddamn voice acting I have ever heard.
About 2 months ago, there was this incident involving these zombie-like creatures.
And whether intentional or not, the corny voice acting makes the game's narrative much more enjoyable for me. Hopefully this video can help explain why myself and many others still find this game to be enjoyable all these years later, even with its more poorly aged elements. And if somebody out there is watching and has ever been curious about the older Resident Evil games, but kind of has been like avoiding them because they're outdated, the control sucks, I don't want to learn how to do that, whatever. Hopefully this video will kind of encourage that person to give these games a proper chance, because I think there's a lot of fun to be had with these games, and especially with RE2. Resident Evil 2 is a timeless classic, and in my opinion, it is the best survival horror game ever made. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.